You are in the courtyards of the Forbidden City in the year 140, watching as young women in silk robes are brought to the emperor's chambers. Their feet are tied with such force that walking is not possible. Their bones have been broken and reshaped deliberately to form the lotus shape that symbolizes perfect femininity. These women cannot run. They cannot even stand without help. They are living dolls, carried as precious cargo to serve the desires of the Son of Heaven. The Chinese Imperial Harem was not only about imperial pleasure. It was a system designed to control, to manipulate, and finally to destroy the human spirit through systematic psychological torture disguised as luxury. What you are going to discover comes from imperial records, from testimonies of palace servants, and from archaeological evidence that reveal how the most powerful empire on earth used sexuality as a political instrument for more than 2,000 years. The scale itself should terrify you. During the reigns of Emperor Wan and Emperor Ling, more than 20,000 women lived imprisoned inside the walls of the palace. The Ming emperors kept 9,000 concubines, most of them taken from their homes throughout the empire. It was not about single incidents or temporary practices. It was systematic human trafficking, directed by the imperial authorities and justified as a divine mandate. The selection process seemed like a horror story written by officials. No home in the empire could escape the Sunu elections, the elegant female recruiters who spread across the provinces like a plague. Government officials went to the villages with fixed quotas and examined girls only 13 years old for imperial service. Naked, weak, or malnourished, all could be chosen. Parents sometimes mutilated their daughters, breaking additional bones beyond the common foot binding, leaving scars on their faces, or giving them substances that stunted their growth. The empire created a society in which even loving mothers felt forced to injure their daughters in order to save their lives. The villages learned to hide their most attractive girls in caves and in forests when imperial scouts approached, forming secret networks to protect them from their own rulers. But the real horror was not the selection process. The real nightmare began after these women disappeared behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. The palace turned into a prison where wealth and luxury covered the most complex system of psychological torture ever created. Each comfort carried invisible chains. Each privilege brought the threat of death. Inside the harem, concubines were divided into rigid categories with elaborate titles that decided everything, from the quality of their food to the color of their clothing. A single promotion could mean the difference between comfort and neglect, between influence and invisibility. The system promoted jealousy and rivalry because women divided were easier to control. Imperial secretaries recorded every intimate act of the emperor with brushes dipped in red ink, documenting his sexual encounters as if they were military campaigns. Chinese calendars were not used to register seasons or festivals. They existed to schedule the imperial chambers and to organize human sexuality as if it were agricultural rotations. The rotation of concubines followed regulated rules designed to maximize imperial pleasure and to reduce the chance that any woman could gain too much influence. Women had to bathe with special preparations before each imperial visit, and court doctors examined them like cattle prepared for the market. Their most private functions were recorded in official documents that survive in today's archives. The empire treated sexuality as a resource to be managed with the same precision applied to grain storage or tax collection. The psychological torment was calculated systematically. Most concubines spent their entire lives in the palaces without ever seeing the emperor, living in a state of constant expectation that slowly destroyed their sanity. They were forbidden to communicate with the outside world. They were isolated from their families and surrounded by rivals who might poison them to get imperial attention. And the few women who gained the emperor's favor faced different horrors. Success turned them into targets for murder. Their food was tasted by servants, who often died from poisoned dishes aimed at high-ranking victims. Pregnancy became a death sentence, because rival concubines would do anything to prevent their enemies from producing imperial heirs. Palace medical records describe countless mysterious abortions and infant deaths that were in reality systematic killings of children. The palace eunuchs held enormous authority in this system, controlling access to the emperor and running the daily functions of the harem. These men had been castrated as children, their sexuality destroyed to make them guardians of imperial women. But the surgical removal had created twisted characters, filled with anger and a hunger for power over those they were meant to protect. Corruption among eunuchs became famous throughout the history of China. They stole treasures of the emperor, sold positions in the hierarchy of the harem, and used artificial instruments to sexually abuse the women under their protection. Lu Jin and 7 other eunuchs were called the 8 Tigers because of the way they terrorized the empire through their control of palace women. These castrated men had turned their mutilation into a weapon, making their damaged sexuality into tools of oppression. The most chilling detail was that the system normalized murder as a professional punishment. Concubines poisoned the meals of rivals, arranged mysterious accidents, or paid eunuchs to eliminate competitors. Lady W, the favorite concubine without children of Emperor Qianhua, murdered every imperial child she could find, often also killing the mothers, in her desperate attempt to remain the only focus of imperial attention. The palace became a killing field disguised as paradise, where women trained themselves with dozens of poisons, learned to notice the smallest signs of manipulation in cosmetics and medicines, and built spy networks to watch possible threats. Each meal was a risk, each gift a possible weapon, each friendly word a trap. The binding of feet that stopped these women from escaping served many purposes beyond simple control. The breaking and reshaping of bones created a permanent state of weakness that reminded them of their helplessness. The lotus feet were considered the ultimate symbol of female beauty, but also made sure that any woman who angered the emperor could easily be caught again if she tried to run. It was not an ancient practice of a distant world. The Imperial Harem system lasted until 1911, within living memory of people whose grandparents had witnessed these horrors. The forbidden city that tourists see today was built on the bones of countless women, whose names were erased from history, and whose pain was hidden behind architecture that still amazes visitors. The systematic nature of this oppression shows how power could corrupt every part of human life. The Chinese emperors wanted not only sexual pleasure but total psychological control over thousands of women, turning intimacy into a weapon of domination that shaped Chinese society for centuries. The most terrifying event in the history of the harem came in the 16th century, when 16 palace women decided they had suffered enough torture. The Renyong plot marked the collapse of the imperial system. The women who had been dehumanized finally resisted their torturer. But what happened to them revealed the true depth of imperial cruelty. Emperor Jiajing was a sadist who raised sexual violence into an art. His concubines were beaten violently into submission before being forced to satisfy his increasingly twisted fantasies. The emperor had become obsessed with alchemy. He was convinced that drinking mixtures made from the menstrual blood of virgin girls would give him immortality. Girls of 13 and 14 years old were locked up for this, fed only mulberry leaves and rainwater until their bodies produced the red substance he wanted. The attempted assassination itself seems like a nightmare. The women held the emperor while one concubine tried to strangle him with a ribbon of her own hair. When this failed, they tied a silk curtain around his neck. But in their desperation, they tied the wrong knot and could not pull it tight enough to finish the act. One conspirator panicked and reported the attempt to Empress Fong, sealing the fate of the 16 women. The punishment was death by 1,000 cuts, an execution designed to increase pain while entertaining spectators. The women were slowly dismembered while still alive. Their families were dragged from their homes and given the same punishment. The empire turned resistance into a public spectacle of torture, making sure that future generations of concubines would understand the price of defiance. But the emperor's sexual perversions went far beyond ordinary sadism. The red lead ritual required a continuous supply of virgin girls whose bodies were treated as alchemical laboratories. These girls were kept in isolated rooms, their diets controlled in order to change the chemistry of their blood. Every bodily function was observed by court physicians, who recorded the effects as if they were scientific experiments. When the girls became sick or when their blood no longer matched the emperor's demands, they were simply discarded, thrown into unmarked graves inside the palace grounds. Archaeological excavations have uncovered mass graves full of remains of young women, whose bones revealed malnutrition and systematic abuse. The emperor's pursuit of immortality had created a factory that produced human suffering. Corruption spread across the palace system like a plague. Chief Eunuch Lu Jin demonstrated how power could transform victims into monsters. After being castrated as a child, Lu Jin developed artificial techniques to continue sexual abuse, using iron instruments to rape palace women. Judicial archives record how one woman died in her bed due to wounds caused by these devices. Her death was treated as a small administrative detail, and the eunuchs created their own hierarchy of abuses. High-ranking castrated men used their status to torment both women and subordinate eunuchs, developing elaborate systems of punishment in which sexual violence was both entertainment and a method of social control. The palace had become a closed environment of trauma, where each resident was at once victim and perpetrator. The palace women learned to survive in this hell through methods that would make modern psychologists weep. They developed the ability to completely dissociate during sexual encounters, building mental compartments that let them endure repeated traumas while keeping the appearance of obedience. Some became so skilled at detachment that they could smile and laugh while being raped, while their minds retreated to safe places unreachable to their tormentors. The most successful concubines mastered the art of strategic pregnancy, arranging their fertile periods to coincide with imperial favor while secretly using herbal contraceptives to block unwanted children. They learned to detect the smallest traces of poison in their food, built immunity to toxins through gradual exposure, and organized complex systems to examine everything they ate. Women formed secret alliances that acted as hidden resistance networks. They invented coded languages through flower arrangements, embroidery designs, and the placement of personal objects to signal threats, opportunities, and warnings. A chrysanthemum placed in a certain vase could warn of poison at supper. The position of a hair ornament could signal that a rival was preparing an attempt at murder. These networks extended through the whole palace hierarchy, including rare sympathizers who preserved some humanity despite their own suffering. Low-ranking servants risked their lives to carry messages between concubines, building communication channels the imperial system never fully controlled. Some women spent decades constructing these invisible networks, preparing for chances that might never come. The palace medical system turned into a weapon in ways that still astonish modern doctors. Court physicians were forced to take part in systematic torture disguised as medical care, performing procedures intended to reshape women's bodies for imperial pleasure. They developed methods to heighten sensitivity in some areas while adorning others, creating customized human beings for specific sexual use. Medical documents describe surgeries performed without anesthesia on fully conscious women. Operations designed to alter their anatomy according to imperial taste. Women were treated as machines that could be adjusted and improved by careful engineering. Doctors who carried out these procedures left detailed records that read like instruction manuals for creating perfect sexual objects. Psychological control extended into all aspects of palace life, including the food system. Food was prepared not only for nourishment, but also for control of behavior with herbs and chemical additions to influence mood, energy, and sexual response. Women never knew if their meals contained aphrodisiacs, sedatives, or hidden poisons meant to make them more submissive. Even clothing was used for control, with garments tailored to restrict movement and emphasize weakness. The famous loose tunics of palace women were not only items of style. They were carefully designed fastenings that made escape impossible while heightening the image of female helplessness that emperors found exciting. The empire had perfected the art of making oppression look beautiful, constructing a system where victims helped in their own destruction while believing they served something sacred and meaningful. The most destructive weapon in the imperial arsenal was not poison and not torture. It was hope. The palace created elaborate systems to convince women that advancement was possible, that obedience would be rewarded, and that their pain had a greater purpose. This psychological manipulation was more powerful than any physical restriction because it made victims into willing participants in their own destruction. Palace ceremonies celebrated promotions within the harem hierarchy with religious rituals that convinced women they were rising to divinity instead of sinking deeper into hell. The new concubines saw these complex rituals and persuaded themselves that obedience would lead to power and protection. The empire had created a lottery system in which the prize was only a little less suffering, and desperate women would do anything to obtain a winning ticket. The most insidious part was that the system convinced women to watch and control each other. Older concubines were given authority over younger ones, forming a chain of command where victims became executioners. The women who had survived years of abuse were rewarded with the power to impose the same treatment on the new arrivals, making sure the cycle of trauma continued without imperial interference. These older concubines developed methods to break the new women that were more advanced than anything the eunuchs could create. They understood female psychology in a way that castrated men never could. Knowing exactly which emotional buttons to press to destroy resistance, they discovered the deepest fears of each woman and used them as weapons, creating personal torture programs that left no physical traces. The training of new concubines included systematic psychological reconstruction that made the deprogramming of modern sex seem easy. Women were forced to practice elaborate submission rituals for hours every day. Their bodies were conditioned to respond automatically to imperial commands. They learned to suppress natural reactions, to smile when they were terrified, to act excited when they felt disgust, to perform gestures of devotion in 17 different forms, each designed to create special emotional responses. One concubine, named May, spent 3 years perfecting the skill of tears. She learned to cry as a way to survive. Palace records describe her imperial show of tears. Tears of happiness, tears of gratitude, tears of sorrow, tears of longing, tears of manipulation. Her suffering was transformed into a form of theatrical art. The empire kept detailed psychological profiles of every woman in the palace, every friendship, every sign of resistance, with records of fears, desires, weaknesses, and breaking points. These files were updated constantly. Informant networks reported every conversation that the women had. Imperial doctors and scholars collaborated to describe experiments on human behavior carried out in the palace, documenting what they found about psychology. The most frightening documents that survive describe projects created to measure the limits of human psychological resistance. Groups of women were subjected to different stresses, and the results were written down as scientific observations. They studied how schedules affected palace women who had given birth. The researchers tested maternal instincts and discovered that intermittent separation from children created stronger attachment than constant presence, producing dependence rather than indifference. They concluded that these separations were deliberate policies designed to traumatize mothers and increase devotion to their children. These psychological experiments also included sexual conditioning programs, mechanical processes designed to link pleasure with submission, pain, and control. The women became sex slaves subjected to carefully programmed routines until they believed their conditioning was natural and their desire was genuine. The Chinese Imperial Harem system represents one of the most systematic examples in history of how absolute power corrupts every aspect of human experience. For more than 2,000 years, millions of women vanished behind the walls of the palace. Their suffering was hidden behind architectural beauty that still astonishes us today. It was not just ancient practices of a distant past. This machinery of oppression lasted until 1911, shaping ideas of power and control that remain in modern society. The Forbidden City stands as a monument built on forgotten graves. Its golden roofs conceal secrets that remind us how quickly civilization can fall into systematic cruelty when unlimited power meets human weakness.